Thank you. It's lovely to be here, and I think that was a really nice segue, actually, from our previous presentation into some of the things that I'll be talking about today. So my name is Liana Downey. I have a background in government, in the corporate sector, and in particular around what does it take to drive complex change. And I'm going to be talking to you today about capturing the opportunity for concentrated solar thermal in the Australian context. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the story to get here. Is that connecting? There we go. So I was approached by the Australian Solar Thermal Research Institute on the back of a question that was asked of them by ARENA, which is a really big question. We've been doing a lot of research and investing a lot. There's a lot of expertise in concentrated solar thermal in Australia, and the question that we were asked was, is there a role for concentrated solar thermal in the Australian context? Given all the research that's been done, is there a role? And if there is, how do we really ensure that concentrated solar thermal is part of Australia's energy mix going forward? So I was asked to facilitate a strategic planning process to answer these questions. And the first step, and a really important step, has actually been lots of discussions with stakeholders. So we've spoken to more than 45 people around the world, many in Australia, but also overseas, to understand their perspective on this question. We spoke to policymakers, both those in government themselves as well as politicians here and overseas. We spoke to potential industrial customers and consumers. We spoke to manufacturers of technology and of all kinds of different technology. And we spoke to people like many of you, researchers, scientists and engineers, to understand what were their perspectives on this question. There are a number of themes that came out of those interviews, and what I'll share with you is our draft strategy, which is really designed to speak to some of these themes that emerged from the interviews, as well as to be able to articulate a pretty clear and coherent position on what for some policymakers can feel like quite a complicated topic. So the themes that we heard from those discussions were that the window of opportunity is essentially now, and that's particularly because in Australia we have done a lot of work. We have built up a lot of capacity. We are recognised in those conversations globally. People talked about envy when they thought about what we built up in the Australian context. But there's a sense that we haven't fully capitalised on it, that we haven't really taken advantage of that opportunity, and that the kind of window is now, that if we're going to do something, the timing is now. There was also a strong sense that our policy settings at the moment are not quite adequate to really solve for long-term, both long-term storage, but also long-term policy planning. And that's not uncommon. Right around the world, as we just heard, we're going through an energy transition, and when you are a government of any stripe and you're trying to step forward through a very complex transition, you kind of get pieces of your policy environment right, and then you find that you need to change other pieces as you go through that process. But certainly that's a theme here, that there's an opportunity in the Australian context for us to tweak the way that we're thinking about energy planning and policy so that we'll actually start to answer some deeper questions that we need to think about for the long term. And we were also just hearing about that nuance around private investment and public investment. The reality is that the benefits that we have experienced in Australia in our energy sector of cheap, bountiful energy come actually historically from public investment in the energy sector. So our coal plants were built with the public purse. And we're now in a situation where we've really got kind of something in between. It differs by state, it differs across the country. We have a mix of private and public settings, but a government who, not unlike most governments around the world, are keen, if they can, to deploy private investment and make things as commercial as possible. So we're also thinking about this question of how might we support, how might policy support a path to commercialisation, and what role does policy need to play? Our work was also supported by research, from a range of different organisations, including ITP and FICNA, as well as global research about what's happening around the world. So what I'm going to share you now is the draft strategy. And again, this is designed not so much for a technical audience with a lot of expertise, not so much for an audience like yourself, but for audiences who may be less familiar with a technology like concentrated solar thermal. And that's important because one of the big things we heard as we were speaking to lots of people was that there was a sense that the current conversations around concentrated solar thermal are a little bit out of date. That some of the conversations that we're having in Australia are kind of balanced on technology and information and cost information that's sort of 3 or 4 years old. And something we heard from a really important senior government official is we're not talking enough about concentrated solar thermal. My work in helping governments think about climate policy over the years has told me that one of the challenges we have, not just with government but with the public, is that we tend to pull sometimes back into this kind of comfort of complexity. We say, oh, well, it's all very complicated. Climate change is very complicated. Modelling it is very complicated. That's true. It's the day-to-day reality. This is complicated. But actually, as we just heard, consumers and governments like simplicity because that enables people to sell a message. People like things when they work and when they're explained clearly. So what you'll see here is an attempt to articulate the opportunity in really quite clear terms, and very interested in your feedback as we work through it. So 4 questions we're answering here. What's the challenge? Why might we even be thinking about something like concentrated solar thermal? What is it? What does it do? Does it make sense for Australia? We think it does. Why does it make sense for Australia? And what do we need to do to make it work? Hang on, sorry. It's a bit... Is that this forward button there? It's just not that. Oh, it's gone a bit haywire. Oh, there we go.
But that's...
Yeah, we just want the next one, but it's not quite.
That's the last one that's in the deck. Excuse me, AV.
No, we can just pull up the original. It should have all got copied over.
All right. Well, while we're doing some of the AV stuff, I'll start to talk about what's there so we don't run out of time. I think it might be because it's in sections and maybe it's gone to the next section.
Okay. Where do you want me to go from?
Just if you can go to the next slide there.
This
Yep.
one?
Yeah. I can drive it from here if that's easier.
Oh, yeah, that'll still work.
Okay, beautiful. I might stand here anyway so I can stop flicking up there. Okay, so what's the challenge? You all know that renewables are a growing share of our electricity. We can see that pale blue getting bigger and bigger. We've still got a big chunk of fossil fuels in our electricity mix. Obviously, this is just talking about electricity, not about energy more broadly. And we can also see that little pale green, which is the curtailment. So that means we've got renewables that are producing energy that we can't use because we don't have adequate storage. And we know that clean green storage at night remains a challenge, and renewable storage at night remains a challenge. So if you see this chart, along the bottom we've got the time of day, and you can see that in the early hours on the left here and on the early hours on the right, that's when emissions are going up. So we know that we've got total emissions are at their highest overnight, even though we've got quite a lot of renewables in the mix at the moment. So that's a challenge for us, because at the end of the day, not only do we want to decarbonise the electricity sector, we also want to decarbonise the energy sector. This presentation is focused on electricity because there is a real imminent opportunity for concentrated solar thermal to play a role in the electricity mix. Over time, there's also a really key role for concentrated solar thermal to play in our industrial heat use, but this presentation is focused on what's really kind of clear and imminent, and that's the opportunity in electricity. So if we now answer the question, what is concentrated solar thermal? Again, many of you will know the answer to that question, but for those who don't, at its most fundamental, concentrated solar thermal creates clean, firm energy, and it does that by converting sun into heat, storage and power. And I think one of the key things that has shifted in the way that the world is thinking about concentrated solar thermal is that it used to be that we would see it as somehow a competitor to solar PV. And I think increasingly what we understand now is that there's an opportunity for those things to work together. That when energy systems and mixes are done at their best, they work in tandem. And the reason that is because unlike solar PV alone, a typical concentrated solar thermal plant can have a range of other benefits that it can provide. So it can keep voltage in safe limits, it can provide power during spikes in demand, and it can restart the grid after a blackout. These are all really important system services that we need for a stable grid. And as I mentioned, concentrated solar thermal also allows you to actually store heat, which can then be used directly in industrial processes. So there's a lot of benefits that you get from concentrated solar thermal that are not just about kind of clean green energy or electricity, they're about the other things. So as we think about the political context, we know that one of the concerns as we move out of coal is around employment and our economy. One of the great benefits of concentrated solar thermal is that it allows for the very almost direct transfer of the skills that are used in coal-fired power plants can be utilised in concentrated solar thermal plants as well. So there's opportunities for coal workers, and as we support and it creates export opportunities as well. So as I mentioned, obviously concentrated solar thermal produces both power and heat, and importantly, it provides firm capacity. So it's got storage, long duration storage, and allows you to produce and access that energy. Because of the other services that it provides, when you start to do a comprehensive analysis and really step back and ask the question, what costs might we avoid if we put some concentrated solar thermal into the mix, you start to see that there's lots of costs that we can avoid. We don't need, at the moment there's a big investment in synchronous condensers right around the country. Those are already, that functionality is essentially built into every concentrated solar thermal plant. So that's a cost we can avoid. You don't need to build a new gas peaker plant because you can reduce reliance on gas, and you don't need to build new transmission lines to the same extent. So a lot of avoided costs and medium and long duration storage benefits. Why is it useful as part of a mix? Well, really at its heart, it's because concentrated solar thermal is really good at filling in important shortfalls in variable renewable generation. So this is looking at a winter view, and you can see that this is a series of days, and we get a peak in the middle of the day, as we would expect. The grey is solar rooftop and utility solar PV. And there's other kind of range of storage and generation mixes here. But what you can see, that black line is demand, and you can see where the bright green is, it's allowing us to get above that demand in those night times that at the moment, without something like concentrated solar thermal, it's difficult to have a zero emissions way of achieving the same outcome for that long-term demand. And this is the summer view, very, very similar kind of message and conclusion. Globally, concentrated solar thermal is increasingly playing a role as part of an efficient, stable and decarbonised electricity network. For those of you who are familiar with the concentrated solar thermal, you'd be aware that there was a big build-out a while ago in Spain. That was built out as a generation technology. It didn't include storage. But what we're really seeing now is that countries around the world are increasingly looking, particularly as they add more renewable energy into their mix, for a solution like concentrated solar thermal, which will help round out their production and give them that long duration storage through the evening. China in particular is leading the charge here. Across the world, there are 7.3 gigawatts of operational concentrated solar thermal, with another 3.5 gigawatts planned in the near future. As I've said, what you get with concentrated solar thermal is 24/7 dispatchable capacity. The typical energy duration of modern concentrated solar thermal plants is between 12 and 18 hours. There's 118 concentrated solar thermal plants providing 24/7 dispatchable capacity around the world, and another 90 plants under construction or planned by 2030. As I mentioned, the growth is particularly being led by China. So you can see the build-up of operational capacity. So this is what's actually working right now, and any plants that have wound down are reflected in this. So you can see that there's been a lot of growth in solar thermal capacity around the world. And the costs are coming down. As you would expect with any technology, we know that the more that we build it, the more those costs come down. Noting as well that this is just the costs of energy. One of the challenges in the policy context and in the way that we think about comparing technologies in Australia is we tend to just look at the levelised cost of electricity. And yet technologies like concentrated solar thermal, or when you bundle technologies together like PV and batteries, we know that you're getting different benefits. So this is just looking at LCOE, but when we start to look at long duration storage bundles, you'll also see the second to the right there, concentrated solar thermal at 12 hours and at 24 hours is very competitive. And the reason for that, because for many people you'll think, oh, well, aren't batteries cheap and getting cheaper? The issue is that batteries, if you want to increase the capacity of batteries, yes, you can add them together, so you can kind of stack, you can have a bunch of 2-hour batteries to get you 8 hours of power, but what you're doing is stacking costs one on top of the other. One other challenge with batteries is their operational life at the moment is 15 years. So if you're thinking from an economic perspective, you need to think about that, that factor. Whereas for concentrated solar thermal plants, they last for 30 years, so you don't have to replace them. So this is looking at a comparison of PV with batteries, where it's replaced after 15 years, and it's also looking at that effectively the same output of 1,200 megawatt hours over a 12-hour period and 12 and 24-hour period with the same sort of discharge. So it's kind of like-for-like comparison. And what you can see here, and this is really a function of concentrated solar thermal technology, that for example, in the case of a tower, the bigger you make the tower, the longer the storage lasts, and you actually get exponentially decreasing costs as you approach storage. So it's not linear increases, it's actually exponential decreases in the cost of that storage. So really useful for long duration storage, and that's why it's cost competitive at that level. What about Australia? I've already talked a little bit about the sense that we have got a lot of capacity here. We've got a lot of research and expertise and know-how that we haven't really made the most of. But does it make sense for Australia, even given that? Well, a really important thing to recognise, as many of you will know, that's why we're all here, that we have fantastic solar resources in Australia. We've got about 20% of the world's solar resources, and that compares to about 14% of coal resources across the world. We've got a number of companies in Australia, as I touched on, who have built capabilities across the spectrum of concentrated solar thermal technology, so Vast, RayGen, FPR Energy, different kinds of technologies, lots of patents for different things, and a lot of envy, as I said, when I talk to global colleagues about what we have here and the skills that we have here. I want to talk about China, because China is a really interesting example from which we can learn, because they have built out their concentrated solar thermal capacity very quickly and are continuing to do so, as I mentioned. What's interesting about China is that they're doing so even though, so Australia's got 3 times the resources, yet they are building out really rapidly and we're not. So a really key message here is, I talked about the build-up, they've already completed 1.6 gigawatts. There's going to be 4.4 gigawatts in just a couple of years, and 9.2 gigawatts of concentrated solar thermal capacity by 2030. This is happening. And they've gotten fast, they've gotten efficient at how they're building, and as a result, the costs, not surprisingly, are coming down. I think something that I touched on earlier, really important. We're not talking about concentrated solar thermal as a competitor to solar PV. It's something that works well as a hybrid. And again, you can see that in the China example, where these are the dates, of each of these new plants. as they've been completed, July 23, September 23, and you can see the blue there is when these plants have been built as part of a hybrid, and that's PV, and in some cases wind as well. But it's being built as a hybrid, and that would absolutely be our recommendation here, that it's something you can put together in the same way we're increasingly seeing batteries co-located, but you're going to have longer term benefits, more stability and longer batteries and more efficient costs if you include concentrated solar thermal as part of that mix. So from a financial perspective, what does that mean? Updated modelling suggests that Australia should aim for 10.8 gigawatts of concentrated solar thermal on the NEM by 2050. So this is looking at contemporary understanding of costs in the Australian context, and it's looking at the question of if you're trying to minimise systems costs, you're thinking about avoided costs like synchronous condensers and the like, it makes economic sense, it's rational to include concentrated solar thermal in the mix. And the chart on the right is the capacity, and the chart on the left is the dispatch. So we'd expect to see concentrated solar thermal dispatching about 17% of total electricity in the NEM. And when we look across the west, in the Swiss, we would see something similar. So we would see 1.9 gigawatts and an even higher dispatch rate, almost 30% of total electricity. And that's because in comparison in their mix, you haven't got hydro and you've got smaller levels of coal generation at the moment. So it's not about displacing, as I said, solar PV or wind, it's about complementing it, and something that we really need to start thinking about doing now, if what we're interested in doing is actually having an efficient, modern, stable, low-cost grid. So, okay, all well and good, but how do we actually do that? We spent a lot of time, and you'll see there's lessons from a number of other countries, talking to other countries about what they'd done, what worked, what didn't work. There's a lot of lessons around the world about what has and hasn't worked. And again, I'm going to do a bit of a deeper dive on China because they are by far sort of the most recent and pertinent example of a country going up the learning curve from this perspective. So things that they've done that made a lot of sense and things that we should be thinking about learning from. They've thought about standardisation, which has sped up construction and reduced maintenance. So they said we're going to get clear on the kinds of models we think are sensible, and we're going to build a number of them. In particular, they've tended to focus on solar towers with molten salt thermal storage. It's not the only kind of technology that they use, but there has been a real clear attempt to focus on that and standardise and bring those costs down. And they're also using large capacity electric heaters to absorb excess PV and wind energy. From a market design perspective, they haven't charged capacity fees for consuming excess renewables to store additional heat, and they've used new financing models and tax incentives to drive investment into concentrated solar thermal. Really the key there has been about valuing storage in its own right, and increasingly, while they kick-started with a kind of with some of these feed-in tariffs and storage mandates, they're now moving to a market-based model. So it's a really good model for how can we go through that journey around commercialisation. The outcome's been that we're seeing concentrated solar thermal playing a key role in stabilising renewable energy grids, that there's been a big drop in the cost of the average 100 megawatt solar tower plants, down 46%. And expanded local manufacturing. In terms of what that means for us in Australia, storage mandates are really a good place to start in the first instance to support commercial viability, not as a long-term solution, but as something to get the industry kick-started. We can see that hybrid facilities really increase value. And importantly, coming back to that question of private investment, tariff top-ups can act to de-risk investment, as can long-term contracts. So, in terms of the recommendations for how might Australia take advantage of this technology and take advantage of that window of opportunity today, there's 6 key things that we have seen from around the world, those lessons that we believe will really make a difference in terms of enabling us to build this into our grid and mean that we have a stable, decarbonised and cost-effective grid valuing storage and dispatchability, designing markets and auctions for the long term, de-risking financing through mechanisms like I talked about there, and particularly long-term contracts, supporting scaling pathways, making sure that our modelling is really thinking about the costs of storage and thinking about avoided costs, and supporting standardisation. I'll stop there to see if we've got any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Liana. Okay, we have a few minutes for some questions, so already. Thanks, Renata.
Thank you, and a great summary of where the technology is and what the opportunities look like. I just want to take something from both this presentation and the earlier one, because we see the rapid change in China, right? And and I'm actually going to say that comes down to the style of leadership, and they are taking more of an emergency approach to the opportunity of the energy transition. And they're saying, this is the goal we've set, this is how we're going to do it, let's get the engineers on board and do it. Whereas I think the Western world is taking the adaptive leadership approach, and they're trying to make sure everybody's happy along the journey. And as a result, like, we're going to miss, I fear that process, and it appears sometimes in the strategy outcomes, is that, we have to get the finance right, and we have to get the risk right, and we have to get we don't have time. At some point here, we don't have time to have everything lined up and right. And somebody at the leadership end has to say that this is an emergency and we need to act. Okay, that's just my position.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful point. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting for me, actually, I had assumed going into the conversations with China that the reason they had more concentrated solar thermal in the mix was that it was a really top-down kind of mandate. But talking to somebody who was at the time working with kind of the person who's considered to be the guru of concentrated solar thermal, actually the policy change that they made, they thought it would have, those on the ground thought it would have a different outcome. So interestingly, the policy mechanisms in China were less prescriptive than one might think. They were actually more about saying we need to value storage, so that the big shift that kicked things off was winding back solar and wind feed-in tariffs, because there was a sense that had already kind of gotten a lot of momentum, and the costs had come down, and it's now kind of business as usual in the Chinese context. And it was actually about saying we need storage in the mix. So it was, in a way, it was a little less prescriptive than you think, which I found really interesting. I think the second thing that I'd say is, it's just back to Kimberly's comment at the end of the presentation. We actually do have an emergency in the Australian context, which is our coal-fired power plants are shutting down, and it's really expensive to keep them going. And so one of the things that I think is really important to talk about, and I actually my ears were open when you were giving that little factoid about the costs of extension. One of the really bizarre things in the Australian context is that we have somehow gotten to a position where we think it's not economically rational in some parts of the kind of the national conversation to act on the energy transition, when in fact it's deeply economically rational, both from an avoided cost perspective and my current hat. I'm currently working at SLR Consulting with a group of climate scientists who are doing the physical risk assessment. And we're working with companies all the time who are asking the question, how much is it going to cost me if I don't, they obviously individually can't control what's happening with climate change. So how much of my assets are at risk? And on average, 1 to 5% of a company's asset base is at risk from physical risks. So it is an emergency. And actually, even in the Australian context, we, unlike other countries, have a very clear time frame around coal. Yeah.
We'll take one more, hopefully quick question.
Yeah, quick. I've got two doubts, because my background is an architectural graduate. Then as a salesperson, I sold wind 25 years ago, tried to sell solar 22 years ago. It was a bit early days for amorphous silica semi-transparent PV active. But basically, I didn't get the how we provide power during peaks demand with the thermal solar concentration, and at the same time don't need to build new transmission costs. And then I was wondering, say yesterday, Professor Andrews says, well, the to-go is wind, solar, and then pump hydro. What's the glitch here for the solar thermal in Australia not being the next solution, and what parameters would you use to compare, say, pump hydro to this one in terms of technology? Thanks.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions there. I know we're tight on time. What I might do is take the second question and we can talk about the other one offline. So the second question was, what's the glitch in terms of getting concentrated solar thermal into the mix? Why isn't it sort of there already? Essentially, the way that we do modelling at the moment in Australia is our kind of model calls out at a given point in time and says, what's the lowest cost of generation? So it's not actually asking the question, if you've got a technology like concentrated solar thermal that generates and does storage, does that make sense? So our original model, the ISP in Australia, the Integrated System Plan, was never intended to be a kind of a proper model for planning. It was an answer to a different question of how might we achieve a specific target. We, like a lot of other countries, are needing to really up the level of sophistication of those planning approaches. That's the biggest glitch, to be honest. And as a result of that, there just hasn't been enough kind of recognition and conversation. Lots of other countries are going through it, because it's only as you start to put more renewables into the grid that you suddenly see, oh, hang on, we've got a bit of a problem here. And in part, we haven't wanted to talk about that because we haven't, we collectively, those of us who are interested in this space, wanted to just get some urgency and get a move on with getting renewables into the mix. But we know it does create a challenge, and so how do you think about it? That's kind of the biggest glitch. And I'll finish there.
Thanks so much, Liana.
Thank you.